I want to focus in this first point on verse 10 there, that if we're faithful with little things, then we'll be trusted to be faithful with greater things. You know, so many times it's real easy just to think, man, that we just look past the moment we're in, and we want to look far ahead and think, if I just had this, I would do this with it. And if I just had this opportunity, or this position, or this role, or this job, or these finances, or this relationship, or this friendship, then this is who I would be. This is the kind of friend I would be. And Jesus said, really, that's not true. He said that our habits are not an indication of our position or our role. Our habits are an indication of our faithfulness and our character. That whatever we would do when nobody is around is what we will end up doing when we have an audience. And so God has called us to be faithful with the little things. Everybody say little things. So in our life, that whatever's in your life right now, whatever you consider to be common, ordinary, not really that important, what are you doing with it? What are you doing with it? So here's the thing, is that as we show that we can be trusted with those things that really aren't a big deal for us, while we wait on the big deal to show up, that we treat this like it's a big deal because it's what we have. Now, and again, my point of reference has to be ministry. So just because I'm using ministry doesn't mean that this is just about ministry. But I know that, when we first started the church and we met over in the donut room, thank God for the donut room. And so we were over there and we had tables set up, and not tables, actually we had chairs set up, and it wasn't the donut room at the time. And, just even though we'd have 40 some people at church, that meant that like 15 of them were kids. And so we had like 20 some adults in there for one service on a Sunday, 25, 30 adults. And it wasn't like we showed up and we go, well, we don't have to do very good today. We don't have to preach very good. We don't have to do good worship. Because we only got 25. Now, when we get a lot of people here, we're going to really bring it. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way here. Doesn't work that way out in our world and the job that we do. That the way that we get to prove ourselves is not with what we're going to have, but with what we have. I think it was Henry Ford. He said, you can't build a reputation based upon what you're going to do. You have to build it on where we are today and what we're doing right now. And the opportunities we're given. I remember that, I was working for a large ministry. I was working in the shipping department. And so one day, they had a family meeting. They called us over there. It was a large ministry, 200 or 300 people. And they said, we're going to start having a Sunday morning service. And I remember that, they said, if you're already going to church, and I was kind of committed to a church at the time. But they said, in time, we're going to ask that if you work here, that this is where you're going to church. And I get it. So I remember I'm on the shipping dock, just kind of taking care of some stuff, and the pastor rolls up in his car, and he rolls down his window, and I'm like, hey. I said, hey, pastor. And he goes, good. He said, now, hey, do you want to work with the teenagers, or do you want to work with the singles? And in my mind, I'm sitting there thinking, I guess that my prayer has been answered. This is the church I'm going to now. And so anyway, I was like, teenagers? He said, okay, and he rolled up his window. And in that glorious, spectacular, supernatural moment, my ministry to students in the church was launched. That tremendous, glorious, do you want to work with the teenagers or do you want to work with the singles? Teenagers. In that great move of God, right there in that moment, I was launched into student ministry. That small, common, ordinary moment that became not so common and not so ordinary in setting the course and the direction of my life. Isn't it amazing how it works that way? Isn't it amazing how life is that way, that in God's presence, in His sight, that you and I don't have to wait for somebody to give us a chance. You and I don't have to wait for somebody to give us an opportunity. We can begin where we are with what we have. As a matter of fact, that's where it always starts. That's where it always begins, is what I have in this moment, right now. Not with what somebody else is going to do for me, not with what somebody else is going to give me, but my willingness to step out and go, this is what I have. And it's not much to me, but it's all I have. And so I'm going to be faithful with it. I'm going to use it. It's not going to be wasted. It's not going to sit on a shelf. I'm going to use it to let God do something with it in my life, at my church, in my family, at my school, at my job, in my community. That I'm going to be faithful with the things that I've been trusted with right here, right now. Number one is this, is that where do you get to prove it at? Prove it with what you have now. What are you doing with what you have now? What are you doing with that? How are you using that? How are you using that small thing, that common thing, that ordinary moment, and being faithful with it? Because Jesus said, whatever we do with this will determine whether or not the great stuff gets to come in our life. I've said this before, but it's one thing I have to tell myself. Because it's so true in all of our lives that if you're ever too great to do small things, that means in this moment you're too small to do great things. It starts with the little stuff. Starts with the small things that maybe only you and God know about. The only things that you know that you see, the only things that we do, just that moment of just, I'm just gonna do this. Oh, nobody will see it. God will. He sees. So in this moment, we're faithful. We're faithful. And it prepares us and positions us and propels us to the greater things that God has for us. Jesus said this. Oh, Pastor Rick, I wish you'd talk about deep stuff. Well, Jesus said it. You tell him it's not deep. Jesus, your stuff just isn't deep enough for me. Okay, let me know how that works for you. Anyway, so here's the thing, is that here it is. He's telling us to be faithful with what we have where we are. Number one is this, prove it with what you have now. Look at number two, if you would. Go with me to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's in the Old Testament. It's several books after the book of Psalms. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, you'll keep going, several books over. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. So Daniel chapter 6. Daniel was a guy that was in captivity. He really had, he was a slave. And so you talk about a guy that could feel limited. Here's Daniel feeling limited, a guy that should feel no obligation to anybody whatsoever. Why would I want to help you? I'm just a captive. Why would I want to do anything for you? And yet we look at his life, Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It says this, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and two others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable. Everybody say more capable. It says he said proved himself. Say proved himself. Than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. So Daniel proved himself. He was put in this position, and in the position, he just proved himself. You know what? When he began to prove himself, the king didn't know that he would have future plans for him. Daniel didn't know that the king had future plans for him. He just proved himself where he was. And I wonder, because it wasn't like the king walked up to him one day and said, Daniel, I just had this God thought. No, man, it was probably a conversation that the king had with very trusted advisors and that type of thing before Daniel ever knew about it. Like, dude, have you seen Daniel? That guy, you can just trust him with stuff. I give him a job and he does it. I let him do things and he does it with excellence. He makes it better. I never hear him complaining. He never gripes about the decisions that I make. He's just doing it. He's just making it happen. And so the king's like, you know what? At some point, I just want one person that's going to answer. These other people are going to answer to him. That person's going to answer to me. I think Daniel's our guy. Well, I'm sure somewhere along the lines that Daniel got discouraged and probably maybe even gotten frustrated. Because here's what we have to think. We read about these people, and sometimes it's kind of like Facebook. For some of them, we see them in their best moment and think, man, I wish my kids were like their kids. I wish I could make chili like that. There's all sorts of things like that. And yet they're humans just like we are. And they had their down days. They had their good days. They had their best days. And all this is going on, and Daniel has no idea that the king is making plans to promote him. In other words, it wasn't like the king said, if you start doing good, I got something else for you. He was being faithful where he was. Do you know when you get to prove yourself? When you don't know what's next. When you don't know what the next thing is for you. When you don't know where the next thing that God has for you. When you don't know, is this all I'm ever going to be doing? That's when you get to prove yourself. Well, if I was just here, then I would really do this. Why aren't you doing it right now? We get so caught up, right? I think about us as a church. There are so many needs. There's so many needs. Sometimes people go, why don't you do this? I'd like to do them all. I'll do them all. And sometimes so that I won't be misunderstood, my flesh goes, well, just don't do anything. Because if you do for this, but you don't do for that, somebody's going to criticize you. Yeah, you like being good to the community, but you weren't good to this thing. Okay. But you know what I've discovered? What we would do for everybody, let's at least do for one. We can't do everything, but we can do something. And we don't let the critics of those that would criticize us for what we do. I remember we were handing out backpacks the last church I was at, and somebody got mad, and I thought, man, there's 50 churches in town that aren't giving out backpacks, and they're not being critical of any of them, but this is the one they're going to criticize. I don't know why I'm off on this. I didn't talk about this at all in the first service. Anywho. Man, I'm kind of uncomfortable. Anyway, so. But we have to do what God has called us to do and just push past it. And then we don't know what the future holds a lot of times. That's called faith. It's called trusting God with our future. How am I going to get there? I don't know. I don't know the way, but I know the way maker. And so he's the one that gets us there. He's the one that takes us there. While I'm proving myself in this moment, when I don't know what's next, I know what I want. I know what I would like to see happen. And maybe that desire was placed there by God. I know for the major moves in my life, and I don't know if the Lord does this for everybody, but this is what he does for me. Psalm 37:4 says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. That every time there's been a major move, it began with this desire that could not be satisfied with anything else. But there was also a frustration with it because I'm like, I have no idea how it's going to happen. So what do you do in the meantime? You're faithful where you are. You don't know what it is, or you don't know where it is, or you don't know how it's going to be. Daniel's faithful. I've seen it in church. I've seen it in ministries. You probably have seen it at your job. I was in one situation in a church, and we had a person that was just really faithful, wanted to be in full-time ministry, and I was around conversations, and I knew that the conversation behind the scenes was that when this door opens up, we're going to offer him this position. And it was just so close, but you can't tell people that. Because then they're like, hey, when's so-and-so going to leave? When are they going to leave? When they start putting the for sale signs in their yard and stuff like, hey, just in case you're thinking about going, so you don't say anything. You just watch. And just before it happens, man, they get offended, impatient, and they leave. And a month later, that door opens. You're like, did God send you? Or did you get offended? Just understand this, man, that one of the tools the devil uses to get you out of God's place is offense. And so Daniel had no idea. He had no idea what was coming next. The king was making plans for Daniel because of how well he was not going to do, but because of how well he was doing with what he had in his hands before him. What are we doing with our stuff? What are we doing with our moment, our place, our common, our normal, our little deals, our small things? Number two is this, is you get to prove it when you don't know what's next. Pastor, I don't know what's next for me. I don't know with my job. I don't know what's next relation. I don't know what's next in my life. You be faithful where you are. In this moment with what you have. You don't have everything you want, but you have something. Amen. Be faithful with that. Prove it when you don't know what's next. Look at number 3, and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Acts chapter 1. That's in the New Testament again. It's the 5th book of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. This takes place after Jesus was crucified, after he was raised from the dead. Then he appears to the disciples. He talks to them, and then he gives them instruction, and then he goes up to heaven. And so Judas Iscariot, as many of you know, he was one of the 12 apostles, and he betrayed Jesus and committed suicide. And so they get to this place, and it says, and Peter said this, he said, so now we must choose a replacement for Judas from among the men who were with us the entire time we were traveling with the Lord Jesus. from the time he was baptized by John until the day he was taken from us. So they're going to find a replacement for Judas. And here's the qualification. They had to have been with us the entire time. In other words, when Jesus was baptized till the time that he was raised from the dead. Now, think about that for a minute. That's over a 3-year period of time that those things took place. And to be qualified, that was what they did. I wonder how many people started with them, but got discouraged, got offended, got frustrated, and left. So here's what they said. So he said, whoever is chosen will join us as a witness of Jesus' resurrection. So they nominated 2 men, Joseph called Barsabas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. Then they all prayed, "O Lord, you know every heart. Show us which of these men you have chosen as an apostle to replace Judas in this ministry, for he has deserted us, and gone where he belongs." Then they cast lots. He's like, what's that? It's some kind of like gambling game or something like that. You're like, oh, praise the Lord, man. I knew there's a scripture that backed me going to the casino. So anyway. No. Okay. You can do it at church, apparently. Anyway. All right, so then they cast lots. And Matthias was selected to become an apostle with the other 11. So I think about this moment. Let me share another moment with you. And you don't have to turn there, but let me read this to you. In the book of Luke 6, verse 12 through 17, says this. One day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples. In other words, he said, guys, I've been praying, and I've got direction from the Father. I'm supposed to pick 12 of you. And so he chose 12 of them to be apostles. Here are their names: Simon, whom he named Peter; Andrew, Peter's brother; James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus; Simon, who was called the Zealot; Judas, son of James; Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him, was chosen over Matthias. When they came down from the mountain, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area, surrounded by many of his followers and by the crowds. There were people from all over Judea and from Jerusalem and from as far north as the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. So Matthias was with them from the beginning, and he wasn't one of the 12 at this time. Do you know where that put him? He was with the followers and the crowd. I bet he felt invisible. I bet the devil told him, you don't matter. He doesn't see you. He sees these 12. And I wonder if in those 3 years, if he began to be aware that Judas was stealing from the treasury. I wonder if as he watched Judas, he began to notice that some things weren't right. And if the devil ever planted that thought in his mind, like, he chose Judas over you, why would I want to stay here? I wonder in that moment, whenever all this time they've all been following, they've all been on the same level, and all of a sudden Jesus says, you 12, you're right here with me. We're going to minister to the rest of them. Matthias is not one of the 12, he's one of the rest of them. You ever felt overlooked before? You ever felt invisible in your situation? Mistreated? Unappreciated? Unrecognized? Unfair? Probably could have had a conversation with Matthias. I wonder how many people started out. But on that day, when they went, one of the 12 said, I'm out of here. He didn't pick me. Why would he not pick me? I've been more faithful than that guy has. Matthias could have done that. And on that day, when he's not mentioned in any of the Gospels, Matthew doesn't mention him, Mark doesn't mention him, Luke doesn't mention him, John doesn't mention him. Because even in those moments when he had an opportunity to be offended, to feel unimportant, when the devil said, why would you give your life to this? Why would you invest here? Why would you commit here? He doesn't care about you. But he stayed. Just so many times, man, I can just get my eyes in the wrong place, on the wrong person, on the wrong people or the wrong things. And it can discourage me. even wound me, and I can feel like I've been mistreated, underappreciated, and not been valued or anything. And why was this person promoted over me? I work harder than they do. I remember there was one organization, man, I'd get there early. When they didn't have time, they didn't have the money to pay overtime, I donated my time. This person would clock out as soon as it was time to go home, and if we had more work, I'd say and give it. And an opportunity arose we both want, they didn't even look at me. That was so frustrating. But I remember then when I was going into youth ministry, and Tina and I ended up at this one church in Arkansas, and we were there for a short period of time. It had some issues, and we'd been married now over a year, and so the church is going through some issues. It ends up having a split, and we hadn't been there long enough to cause it. Give us time. But anyway, so. But they both wanted us, and so I'm kind of confused. And I remember I called back to a friend of mine at this organization. I said, man, I don't know what I was supposed to do. And he said, so you don't have any leading? I said, no, really. I said, they both want me. He said, well, if you don't have any leading, here's my wisdom. Don't go to either one. He said, you'll create the least amount of pain by going someplace else entirely, by not picking one of them. I said, that sounds like wisdom. He said, I know of a job in Clovis, New Mexico. They're looking for a youth pastor, and that guy's going to be here several weeks from now. And he said, I'll set up an interview for you guys if you want. I'm like, of course. So we went down there with our 6 months worth of experience. And I remember he interviewed us, and I found out not only was he going to interview us, he was going to interview 9 other people, 9 other couples. Most of them had more experience. They were better speakers. They were prettier. They had better hair. They could sing. You just fill in the blanks on a resume of things that you want. They had. And I'm like, why would they want me? And come to find out, that place that at times that I felt invisible, the guy that was in charge of it, he came to that guy and he said, look, he said, I don't know about these other 9 people, but I know about this guy. He stayed, he was faithful. And that little reference right there pushed me from the back of the line to the head of the line. We don't always know who's watching, and we don't know who's not watching, but the one that we know that is watching is God. Amen. And you're not invisible to him. I remember thinking in youth ministry, I thought, man, we started and we had like our first Wednesday night, we had 30 students, and I was so excited. And we did such a great job that the next week we had 20. And so I thought, man, it's just gonna, and so I began to pray, and I was like, God, I want to be a youth pastor at a church of 300. So in my mind, what would happen is that some church would recognize our great giftedness. They would recognize how spectacular we were in dealing with students. And they would come and they would call on our phone and go, we've heard about you, and we have this large youth group. Would you please come down here and grace us with your presence? I'm still waiting on the phone call. For whatever reason, our greatness was invisible to them because God had a different plan. He said, I'm not going to take you to that place. I'm going to make you that place. Yeah, glory to God. And so we have to be faithful with what we have, with what's been given us. You may feel like Matthias right now. You may feel unappreciated. There may be people that have been promoted over you, put in positions over you, that it's like created a wound in you because it makes no sense. It's almost like they think that they're more valuable to this than me. Now, I think all of us have dealt with that in organizations, in church, at our jobs, in schools, in relationships at some point or another, right? There's been that wound, that pain that feels like rejection that we've all been hit with at some point or another. And I believe Matthias went through that. And you know what he did? He kept showing up. Others left. He's one of the apostles of the Lamb, one of the 12 that was chosen to establish churches and be a witness of the resurrection of Jesus. And his resume was, for the last 3 years, when others were picked over me, I kept coming. What a great story. Number 3 is this. Prove it when you feel invisible. Prove when you feel like nobody notices you. If that's you right now, if you feel invisible, unseen, what do? Be faithful. Be faithful. This is how you prove